Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, should Nelson's column be pulled down? The writer and broadcaster Afua Hirsch is calling for the London landmark to be removed because she says he was a white supremacist. This comes after the planned removal, of course, of a Confederate monument in the US city of Charlottesville last week that ended up sparking a violent far-right rally. Sky's David Bowden has been to meet Afua Hirsch.
Lord Nelson, one of this country's great heroes, a man who gave his life for this country, and of course a great tourist attraction here in Trafalgar Square. But there are some people, among them columnist Afua Hirsch, who believes that this man and his statue should go from public view. Why?
Well, when you think of Nelson, I think most people think about the things you just said, you know, naval hero, gave his life for this country, but how many people actually know that he was what we would now call in modern language an unashamed white supremacist? And I say that not lightly, but because at a time when even other grandees of the day, when Parliament was vigorously debating the need to abolish slavery, Nelson was vigorously defending it. He believed that black people were inferior, that they belonged on plantations working under conditions of torture and exploitation, and he used his incredible position of influence to try and prolong that situation. So I think it can be a bit of a distraction to talk about ripping Nelson down, although, you know, it's quite a powerful image. But my real issue is that when we remember these figures from British history, we don't remember the full picture. We only remember the pro-imperial propaganda, that he was a good person, he was a hero. He was so deified that he was compared to God himself at his funeral.
But he was of his time, wasn't he? I mean, clearly you wouldn't get away with that. You wouldn't want to get away with that today. We've moved on, time moves on. This is history. It's right in the middle of central London. Everybody, whether they live in this country or all over the world, knows it exists. Why do you have a problem with it? You can put the context in, people can read the context, but we don't need to mess with this, do we?
Well, you say we've moved on, David, but where are the statues to the people who were oppressed by people like Nelson? Even in this statue, there's a figure of an African sailor there. He was probably one of the people who fought for Britain, risked his life for this country, and then was left destitute by the government, who failed to deliver the promises to look after them after the war. These people are as integral a part of our history as figures like Nelson, but where are their monuments? Where are they remembered? And you know, for somebody like me, I'm British, I'm as British as you. I walk around this great city and I only see tributes to the Nelsons, to the Churchills, to the people who believed that I was inferior just because of my race and my skin colour. And I don't see that balanced out anywhere. And to me, that's not the truth about British history. It's only part of the truth.
After we certainly started a debate, I suspect that Nelson is probably going to be here for a while. But if Afua gets away, then perhaps you should book your tickets and come now. He might be gone soon.
Confederate statues are coming down, being vandalised or covered over across the United States, with the debate over whether they are part of history or a symbol of oppression dividing the country. Here too, there have been calls to tear down monuments which celebrate Britain's colonialist past. And the latest on that list, Nelson's column.
America's latest divide, statues and monuments, the battle for the political present symbolised by who towers over the past. Cities across the US have been protesting the presence of Confederate statues in their public spaces. Now a growing number of American institutions are removing statues of Confederate leaders. But in places like Charlottesville, the debate turned deadly after a protester was mowed down at a white nationalist rally. But what about Britain's past? Last year, Oxford students demanded the statue of colonial figure Cecil Rhodes should fall, but his presence still remains. So should Nelson's column be the next to be toppled? Long regarded as one of Britain's greatest military heroes, today one commentator described him as a white supremacist for vigorously defending slavery.
Well, with me now is Afua Hirsch, who wrote that Guardian article suggesting Nelson's column should come down, and Laura Perrins, who's co-editor of The Conservative Woman. Welcome to you both. Afua, can I turn to you first? This is a man who is regarded by so many as a national hero. It is an icon for tourists in Trafalgar Square. Why on earth would you want it to come down?
Well, I wonder how many of those tourists and British people who stand and gaze at Nelson on his 50-metre plinth realise the full picture of his contribution. So yes, we remember him because of his naval victories in the Napoleonic Wars, but at the same time he used the very unique privilege and influence he had as a result of those naval victories to defend the institution of slavery, to try and further it, at a time when even his contemporaries were arguing that it was time to abolish the institution that was enslaving and exploiting millions of Africans. So even in the context of his own time, he had a very questionable moral record. And my question is, why is that not remembered as well? Why is that not part of the history that we recall in our national imagination?
Well, Laura Perrins, how do you feel about this? Nelson is a white supremacist and this statue must come down.
I think that's an incredible thing to say, and this iconoclasm and calling someone like Nelson a white supremacist really shows how the left loathes the very foundations of Britain and Western civilization itself. You know, there'll be book burning in Trafalgar Square next. The critical issue is, and you've admitted it yourself, that that people don't know or anything about, or very little about, Nelson's slave-supporting past. When you're looking at a statue, you have to ask yourself two questions. First was, why were the statues erected and what were the men known for? And that's the critical difference between Nelson and Lee. Lord Admiral Nelson gave his life for Britain against colonial pro-slavery Napoleon. Confederate Lee took up arms against his own country. And so that's the first critical issue. Lee was a traitor, Nelson is a national hero.
Well,
the second
let's
issue...
just bring Afua in on that. So there is a difference between US statues, which were erected in the 20s or the 60s against desegregation of the US, and these statues in Britain, which are much older and are not political points against racial equality, as it were.
Well, I think we're very happy and self-congratulatory to sit here and say that it's completely different. The point is that these monuments aren't erected as a neutral act. They're erected to further a specific political message. It's an act of propaganda that Britain had a very specific past. Now, if you look at our history curriculum, if you look at the way we talk about Britishness, I think that's very present in our modern notions of what Britain is. We often hear our politicians, from Michael Gove to David Cameron to Gordon Brown, saying that we should be celebrating Britain's history, that history is a kind of celebratory subject. And I think that's obscuring the truth. Now, I don't think that ripping down statues is necessarily the whole solution. What I would like is some context and some honesty. And it's very interesting to say that this is kind of liberalism gone mad. I think that it's people like me who actually favour British history being talked about and studied as a serious subject with all sides on the table. I don't support this fragility that British people can't handle the truth about our past. I think we can handle it, and it's time to
Laura
hear it.
Perrins, is there a whitewashing of history going on?
You're shifting the debate here. Now you're saying we want to discuss it. Previously you'd said you wanted to tear down the statue of a national hero who gave his life for this country. And actually, Lord Nelson was critical in bringing about an end to the slave trade. The Battle of Trafalgar was won in 1805, which meant that Britain controlled the high seas. Then when Wilberforce passed the Abolition of Slavery, International Slave Trade Act, 2 years later, 1807, Britain was able to control the seas and actually enforce that act against all other colonial slave trades. If it wasn't for the British control of the high seas, the international slave trade may well have continued. He was absolutely critical in dying for his country, in actually making sure that that act counted and didn't lay dying on the statute book. So you can certainly look at him as a whole in history books, but this idea that we were going to go around tearing down monuments, as I said, of national heroes, just reveals the left as the kind of nasty bullies that they are.
Well, I think it's so interesting that you call tearing down statues as a thing that nasty bullies would do, because part of the history we're not remembering is our own role going around the world, destroying other people's monuments, palaces, statues, from China to India to African countries.
And what you're proposing is the same thing then, a cultural vandalism.
I mean, it's easy to talk about tearing down statues. I don't know if you actually read my column beyond the headline, but actually I'm interested in context. And I think it's also very interesting that you mentioned Wilberforce. We have this amnesia. When we think of abolition, we think of William Wilberforce. How many of us know the names of the black slaves who became literate authors?
Equanu.
Exactly. Yeah, there are so many, and actually they're not commemorated.
You should lobby,
that's why we're having
for
this
that
conversation.
kind of commemoration, not for the destruction of national heroes. That is not acceptable. But by all means, our history continues, our history evolves, and those kind of people should be properly remembered.
Laura Perrins, are you proud of Britain's colonial past?
Well, obviously I'm mixed, because I grew up in Ireland and we were taught repeatedly the negativity of British colonial past. I mean, you could have a debate all night in relation to the British colonial history. I think it's very simplistic to condemn Britain for its colonial past. At the time, Spain was a colonial power, France was a colonial power, and Britain was a colonial power. And they did want to end traditions such as Suti in India, where wives were burned with their husbands. And remember, Britain was absolutely instrumental in abolishing one of the greatest evils of mankind, and that is the international slave trade, followed by slavery. Once Britain abolished in the international slave trade, slavery itself was doomed in the United States. But they weren't able to do it through parliamentary democracy like Britain, where they had to have a civil war. And that is why Britain, of course, had its weaknesses in its past, but you should remember for the things it didn't happen. It didn't have a ruinous civil war over an issue like slavery, and it has slowly and gradually evolved. I mean, this is why a lot of immigrants want to come to Britain, for the rule of law, for the democracy, for the stability.
I think it's so ironic that
there's some positives to colonialism.
It's so ironic that you call my view simplistic, because that is the most selective account of British history I think I have ever heard. Yes, Britain accomplished some things in its colonies. It also left colonies like Bengal in complete ruin, 3 million dead from a completely avoidable famine. It left Africa in a situation that still today it's underdeveloped. It's being exploited by British companies, by Western governments, without being able to recover the integrity it had before colonialism. I want these facts to be on the table as well. I'm not calling for erasure, quite the opposite. It's about time we acknowledge history
not calling for
in its fullness.
Nelson's column to be torn down.
that is...
You did call for Nelson's column to be topped down. That's
well,
an erasure
if you read my column... Do you
want it torn down or not?
I'm not particularly bothered about whether it's torn down or not, but I definitely am not content for what people like you, with all due respect, have been happy with, which is to leave it there without any acknowledgement in our history curriculum, in our national debate about the truth about what people like Nelson did. And it's all very well to say, leave it there and teach people the full picture. Well, that hasn't been happening until now.
I don't think that's an accurate picture of the history curriculum in British schools. I understand that there's a lot of navel-gazing and self-hatred going on within British classrooms, and I don't think it's fair.
Thank you. Laura Perrins, Afua Hirsch, we're not going to solve this tonight. We're going to have to stop. Thank you.